What's up, everybody? Welcome back to yet another trek through the Mushoku Tensei Jobless Reincarnation novel series. One second. There, much better. Welcome back to Mushoku Mondays. I don't know why I've never actually said that in a video as an opening, but yes, Mushoku Mondays is a thing, and we are on volume 5. I have successfully completed this volume. Hopefully we can get through it all in this one video. We'll see how things go, but I know that one particular chapter was incredibly short, unfortunately, and it's really unfortunate because I really love Roxy, obviously. But yes, without further ado, let's jump into these final chapters. I will say the first one that we're going to go through is Roxy's homecoming chapter, which was totally covered in the anime. I think actually better done in the anime. But yes, the other two chapters, one I can argue will be in the second season of the anime, but the other one is another one that's just completely skipped, and I don't see them going back to it. With all that said, let's jump into it. Let's kick things off with Interlude, Roxy's Homecoming. Like I said before, I think this is actually better done in the anime. Very much so done better in the anime. I think the whole segment with her and Nokopara, I think, was a little bit more fleshed out in the novel itself, but definitely the whole scene of her at Midgard is so much better done in the anime, and I'll get into that as we get into it. But yes, kind of giving us a time frame here. Currently, Rudeus is setting sail from Millis. At this exact same point, Roxy Midgardia is now heading to her hometown, but for the first time in so many years. She knows very quickly Midgard village hasn't changed at all since she left. Everyone looked the same. There was more residents than before, but still, it was just like then, very eerily quiet. Now, she never found this silence strange to her when she was a child. However, now after traveling so many places where, yes, bustling cities and everything with lots of people communicating, yeah, suddenly she now realizes how quiet this place is. Yes, nobody here spoke, but yet they were communicating. Spotting a villager, that villager just stares at her, and she knows this person's trying to speak to me, because the people of the Midgard village all speak through telepathy. This, of course, is a unique ability of the Midgard race. She couldn't understand what they were saying to her, but she could always hear this kind of faint buzzing noise. And unfortunately, as we already know, Roxy cannot respond. Soon after arriving at the village, her parents would eventually appear. Due to their race, once again, they haven't really changed at all. They, of course, welcome her with joyful words and express their concern of the idea that she's traveling alone. But she wasn't really. Elinalse and Talhan were nearby. They just felt like they wanted to give her some privacy, so they decided to camp outside of the village, which honestly I never really got an indication of in the anime. I know that she reunited with them shortly after leaving the village, but it's kind of interesting to note that. Roxy would then tell them about her travels in this calm, dispassionate voice. They expressed how surprised they were at her journeys, and even offered her a place to stay for a little bit. But unfortunately, Roxy was an outsider. While her parents were expressing all their concern and welcoming her, they were doing it with a language that was foreign to them, technically. The people of Midgard never really expressed anything truly important with their mouths, especially when it came to things about love and affection. She knew that her parents were sincerely worried, but they unfortunately had no way of really truly expressing that to Roxy. She couldn't use telepathy, so their messages could never get across to her. That made her exceedingly lonely. Staying there would only be painful to her. Honestly, in return, she would only be rubbing their noses in the fact that she was never really truly a part of the Midgard village. With that said, she immediately said that she was going to set out again. Her father speaks up. Really? Are you leaving already? Can't you just stay for a single night? She's like, no. Unfortunately, my journey is very urgent. I just dropped by since I was in the area. He's like, when will we be here again then, dear? I don't know, but I might not come back at all. At this point, her mother turned concerned. Surely, Roxy, you can come by and visit maybe once every 20 years or so. So it's so funny how time is so different to Midgard. This idea, like, I can never even imagine telling my family or siblings, I might come back in about 20 years. It's just completely different, of course, because they live so much longer. She's like, I suppose, maybe I'll visit in the next 50 years or so. The mom's like, really? You promise? We'll be waiting for you. At this point, Roxy noticed that her mother is crying. She's like, Mom? She's like, oh, I'm sorry. I told myself I wouldn't cry. I'm so sorry, dear. But at this point, at the sight of her mother's tears, something gave way inside of Roxy. Before she knew it, she was hugging her mother tightly, and her father soon wrapped his arms around the both of them. At that point, Roxy realized that words and languages were far from everything. And in the end, she ended up staying for 3 days. For the first time in ages, she finally managed to relax. And that's it. That's the Roxy episode. That's the Roxy segment at Midgard. Like I said before, it was so much. This is the only thing I can honestly say without, I'm not lying to you guys, the only thing I think the anime did better than the light novel. This does convey it. I think the main part of this entire segment, the thing that hit me the most was her saying that words and languages were far from everything. Because that's her concern. She can't hear them. And the Midgards express everything through their minds and speaking to each other with telepathy. And so she feels like whatever words they give, isn't going to be as much as what they can normally speak. And she feels that disconnect. And yes, she feels that her existence is something that it's not normal. I'm not of this tribe. I'll never speak to people. They don't speak my language. But I think what the anime did so much better, and it's not really conveyed very well here, is the idea that, and I'm hoping that it was all under the direction of the writer, that they did this in the anime, but the anime it goes out of its way to show how much the parents struggled to learn a different language. We got to see when Roxy was young and she went out to the children and all she could hear was that buzzing, that crackling, and she felt isolated, and her mother came and embraced her. And then it goes and it transitions to showing the parents learning a different language just to talk to her. They had to learn a spoken language just to speak to their daughter because they couldn't send anything to her in their minds. And it shows that. It shows them learning that stuff. It shows them going out of their way to do anything to connect to her. And then she departs. But when she finally comes back, there was a few points in here that really hit it hard. And I when I did my impressions of that episode, I expressed how great the anime portrayed what was happening without any spoken word, which makes sense because, again, they speak through telepathy, and Roxy can't understand them. But it has this whole point. In the novel, it's expressing that she's like, I shouldn't be here, and I'm just rubbing their noses in it, I'm gonna leave. But what happens in the anime is she looks over, the parents welcome her in, but she looks over at the parents, and they're preparing a fire, and she knows they're talking, but she can't hear them. And they're expressing that here, and it was expressed in the novel in the idea that they have words of expression, but they can't speak it with their mouth. That the McGurds themselves have their own way of expressing that through their minds, and she's not getting it. And she knows that they're sitting there talking to each other, and she can't hear them. She feels isolated. And again, how they portrayed that without a single spoken word, and I knew exactly what they were doing, I cried. Like that episode made me cry. Unfortunately, the novel didn't. The anime made me cry. Like, I cried so much in that episode. But even on top of that, when they're like, oh, you're leaving already? And the mother starts crying, she notes the dolls on the shelf. Everything that they made to communicate and interact with her was on the shelf. And again, that's something that was completely original to the anime. It wasn't really expressed in this novel. That was enough for her to realize, oh, that's right, all that stuff they did for me. All that stuff they did for me. They wanted to communicate and connect to me. Again, here is expressing in the idea that she says words and languages aren't everything. It's what we're doing now. Our connection that we're making right now. They're doing everything they can to connect to me, and I'm not letting them do it. It was just so good. Again, both work, but them together is enough for me. It was just, again, I was a little bit let down when I read through it. I'm like, this is the Roxy chapter. This is the part that made me cry in the anime, and it was like, it didn't really do it when I read it. It just felt like a footnote, if anything. So, give them credit. The directors and everybody, give them massive credits for how they pulled off something that it's not really spoken. It's talking about not being able to communicate. So how do you show that in an actual visual form? It was really well done. So, let's move on. Let's move on. So yes, we cut to talking about the Kennel Master Rudeus. At this point, she has left. She's now communicating with Elinase and Talhan. They're talking about the rumors going around about this Kennel Master. And at this point, they're pretty much convinced. Yeah, we finally realized, Roxy has finally realized it. Yeah, Kennel Master of Dead End is Rudeus. Soon after arriving at the Demon Continent, her and her party was heading to the northward area in search for Rudeus. Further north, more people started recognizing the name of Rudeus. They realized the stories and descriptions of Rudeus overlapped with the Dead End personator. Talhan had pointed out that a human boy that could silent cast spells sounded like the Kennel Master from that party. Roxy had kind of realized this before him, but she didn't really want to admit it. Mainly because she didn't want to admit that she had passed him by without realizing at some point. Like, I had left my pupil back here. Like, I noticed this thing, but I didn't realize it quick enough. From here, we transition to the scene with Roxy and Nokopara at the bar. This is the revelation at this point, yes, that Nokopara was a past member of Roxy's party when she used to adventure on the Demon Continent. She was asking Nokopara about Rudeus, and he was really hesitant to say really anything. Because yes, this is sort of highlighting the fact that he's been doing some very despicable work, and that's the reason why he knows Rudeus. But Roxy wasn't going to judge Nokopara. On the Demon Continent, you really had to do anything you could do to survive. It's a very harsh environment. Dog eat dog. At this point, they're talking about Blaze. She's like, oh, I see. Blaze died on a job, huh? He's like, yeah, that poor bastard was swallowed whole by a red hood cobra. And Roxy starts getting a little nostalgia and remembering her old days hanging out with Blaze. He was this pig-faced, filthy mouth person. He cussed Roxy out anytime she messed up. He wasn't really technically a bad guy deep down. I mean, he was somebody that no matter what, you can rely on him as a warrior. Nokopara had mentioned the fact that he had become a B-rank adventurer at this point before he died, which honestly on the Demon Continent was no small accomplishment. It really did impress Roxy. Knowing the fact that this party that he was a part of was called the Super Blazers, Roxy's like, that guy was never good at naming things. And yes, Nokopara points out that yes, the same red hooded cobra was the one that Rudeus' party took out. And it was by a party that was only recently formed, Dead End. Which means that yes, Rudeus took out a A-rank monster shortly after becoming adventurer. Well, we all argue that it wasn't him, it was Reserved. And technically Edis. She's like, there'll be no chance that I would pull that off. So that definitely sounds like Rudeus. And that put a smile on her face. Nokopara's like, man, you really have changed, Roxy. She looks at her reflection and says, really, you think? It's like, yeah, you seem more grown up. Now, obviously, being a Migard, she knows that she hasn't changed her appearance at all. He's like, I'm serious. It's like the general vibes, I guess. You used to come off of kind of like a kid. She's like, yeah, well, I've put a lot of years behind me. I mean, even if it doesn't look like it. And at this point, she's chucking these toasted snacks inside of her mouth. They're stone treant seeds. She says they don't really taste good, but once you start eating them, you just kind of can't stop. Nokopara noted that her old self, she would do anything. She was so desperate to look like she was a grown-up. And she would be honestly thrilled to have been told what he just told her. She's like, yeah, I suppose I was like that for a while. At this point, she starts to think about her old self. She's like, back then, I didn't even understand my own skills and limitations. I was furiously trying to convince everybody that I was an adult and should be taken seriously, bragging about my talents as a magician and my competence in every aspect of magic. And honestly, her opinion of herself has sort of been completely reversed at this point. With the spread of her reputation, people were constantly expecting her to pull off things that she couldn't. And this is where we go back to what I was saying, like, what was this, like the second volume? How Rudeus was telling everybody that she was able to do things that he was doing because of Roxy. He was spreading all these rumors that she had taught him how to do like silent casting and everything. So yeah, she was getting a lot of reaction of people on the Demon Continent now. Anytime that she mentioned that she was the former teacher of Rudeus. And yes, apparently he had been telling everybody that he owed all his skills to Roxy, his master. So for this reason, everybody believed that she could do silent spellcasting, which yes, she can't. So this made her reflect on her old master, you know, who once kind of disparaged her. Maybe they experienced similar things to this. If that was the case, she felt bad for how she responded to that. It was a hard thing being a mentor of someone who's truly more talented than you are. Apparently, it's something that you just had to kind of experience yourself. At this point, Roxy's like, you haven't changed one bit. He's like, oh yeah? Says, yeah, except obviously physically, of course. She knows that Nokopara has always been kind of greedy for money and that he always kind of preyed on the weak. Even back in the day, Roxy knows that he's kind of somebody that I never wanted to make my enemy. He's like, you're implying that I'm old and wrinkly now? She's like, sure, you could say that. You've gotten old and wrinkly. He's like, man, you've got a mouth on you now, girl. The both of them kind of feeling really nostalgic. You know, back in the day, there was two more of them. A boy who was cursing Nokopara and another one that was trying really hard to break up all the fights with his long sigh. But now only two middle-aged ex-adventurers were left behind. They continued to drink and reminisce about old days until Nokopara kind of drank himself on the table. Roxy had now seen her parents and an old acquaintance. This meant that this voyage, no matter what, wasn't a waste. She was truly happy that she came there. And I think that was a really nice point to leave this particular segment off because honestly, for a long time, you don't get this indication that Roxy was happy to be on the Demon Continent. She was there for this whole search, but it kind of shows that she got some sort of fulfillment out of what she did. And yes, technically I got that from the anime. The moment that she's hugging her parents and they're talking and they're crying, I was like, this was enough. Like, I understand that she would see this as being enough, but it kind of hits home. At this point, we cut to Roxy and she's now with Talhand and Elanase. She figures at this point that Rudeus has already made it to Milshin, assuming they passed each other at the Windport about 6 months ago. Despite it being the rainy season, the Sword Highway was a safe place to travel. Unless he stopped at the Elf or the Dwarf settlement, he should be at the city already. Which, we all know he didn't go to either one of those, but he did go to Doldia. This meant that she didn't have to search for him, just like Paul said in his letter. He had forged across the Demon Continent in no time at all. Yes, most would find this a big struggle, but he made it look easy. On top of that, he somehow recruited a Superb, the thing that Roxy feared the most. At the same time, Elanase and Talhan are just full of compliments. It's an impressive kid. Hard to believe he's Paul's son. Which, yes, they'll take any chance they can at jabbing at Paul. At this point, Roxy kind of downplays herself a lot. Says that no matter who he was a pupil of, he still would have been a prodigy. He was impressive from the get-go. And again, kind of downplaying that she had anything to do with that. He would have pulled this off fine, even if he had never met her. Which I argue, he's a part of the Roxy religion. He couldn't have pulled anything off without your Roxy. You are your Pansu is in a box at his house. With all that in mind, they put their next plans in place. Their initial goal was to find Rudeus, but she knew he was safe. She wanted to see him, but at the same time, they couldn't abandon their overall broader goal. So Roxy says, let's search the northwest region of the Demon Continent. They track down Rudeus, but at the same time, there's 3 other family members that are still missing. And even on the road, they've already found several people that were displaced. There would probably be more in the northwest. Chahan's like, sure you don't want to see your pupil? She's like, yes, I'm sure. She says it would be too humiliating at this point for him to find out that she had passed him by. Her standing as a master is already on shaky ground. She's like, there's plenty of cities in the Demon Continent that hasn't been checked. Let's keep moving like we've been. At this point, yes, obviously Talhan and Elenal say, know what's going on, so they both chuckle. Really cute. I think it was kind of interesting to note, I don't remember anywhere in the anime they mentioned the idea that they technically have already found people displaced on the Demon Continent, which I think is really, really cool because what was this big thing that obviously Rudeus was struggling with? The moment that he found out that there was this catastrophe affected so many people, it hit him hard, and yes, Paul even hit him on it, that he should have been searching on the Demon Continent. He probably passed by so many people, and yes, he figures that he maybe have even passed by his family members. What if he had passed by them? But thankfully, Roxy's basically cleaning up after him. Like, he's already left and she's over here picking up what he left behind. And I thought that was really cool. It's like this whole aspect of that Roxy's like there, even though she's downplaying herself as, you know, his master, she's technically doing something that he had forgotten to do. She's cleaning up after him. And I thought that was really a sweet little note to put onto that. And yes, even going so far to talk about this continued journey up northwest. Which, yes, technically, if you remember the map, Kishirika was way up here in the northeast. So Rudeus would never have gone over to the west. Again, he didn't want to go to the west because that was their alternate path, which would be up to the north area of the map. He went straight down. So he never went anywhere in that northwest region. So she could possibly find somebody over there. She's already went up there to the northeast where he was once at. So she's basically gone his path. She has checked everywhere that he went through. And now she's going to check the rest of the region itself, which I think was really, again, it's really cool to note. And yes, that technically wraps up everything for Roxy's chapter. And like I said, I honestly believe that this was so much better done in the anime. Yes, we get a little more snippets of information here, especially how much Roxy's downplaying herself as Rudeus' master. But again, most everything else was really well covered. And like I said, the whole Midgard village thing was so good in the anime. But let's move on to, yes, the skip part. The part that was the additional skipped content from the anime. And again, this is similar to the whole thing with the port and running into back shill. I don't believe this is something they can technically cover the characters in later on, but it's technically something I don't think is a big deal that they skipped, honestly, because these are characters that never really truly interact. Rudeus doesn't know who these characters are, and so the significance of this isn't that important. My assumption, and this is extra chapter 1, Dragon Meat, Nanahoshi Style. The reason why I think this was skipped in the anime is because I think it puts way too much emphasis on, yes, Nanahoshi. And this is going to be spoilers for those that have not watched the season 1 of the anime. Nanahoshi was a character that Rudeus ran into. Nanahoshi was with Orsted during the second turning point. And I had a lot of speculation for who Nanahoshi was in the anime. I believe, my theory is that she was the girl that was on the side of the road when Rudeus, his old self, went to save her from the speeding truck. So I believe that she transported with him, because in the anime, they specifically say that there was some other people there, but there was only one boy on the ambulance. So I believe that the girl was transported and she's at Orsted's side now. And again, I think that's Nanahoshi. And again, my speculation was just based on the idea that her name was very Japanese. So I figured that she's possibly another isekai. But this chapter basically says, yes, Andrew, she's definitely Japanese. But yes, let's jump into it, and I'll talk more about it afterwards. But again, I wanted to put that preface there that I kind of have a glimpse here of what's going on, and that's based on the anime. Opening up the chapter, Rudeus has just arrived at the city of Eastport. This is, of course, in the Dragon King realm. This is apparently the biggest port city in the world. He does note that the language that's getting used there is the same as the holy city of Milis, but the names and appearances of the shops themselves are subtly different. But at this point, he's noting there's nothing really to report here. I gotta kick out the fact that every time he hits a port city, he has to kind of explain what's going on in the port city, the layout, the buildings and stuff. This one's like, yeah, nothing to report. We're going to the end. But as they're heading there, eventually a whiff of something hits Rudeus' nose. Edis mentions something that there's something that smells really good. He knew exactly what she meant. It was a very tempting aroma. They looked around, they kind of followed the scent until they eventually arrived at this one restaurant. This place was in terrible shape. The bricks outside, there was like holes in the walls and everything. It just didn't look that great. Even the sign was weathered and you couldn't even read the characters on it. It looked more like an abandoned building than an actual dining establishment. Roger at this point's like, you know, asking, do you really want to go inside that place? Which, yes, to Roger's credit, often whenever he's seen an establishment on the Demon Continent that didn't look that great, he would always avoid it because often the taste was similar to the look. But Rudeus says, you know, look for a change of pace. Let's head into here. And so Reserve's like, well, if you say so. He noticed that when he enters the building, the door protested loudly. Everything was just run down. The tables were missing legs. It just didn't look that great inside either. Holes in the floor. Additionally, it was lunchtime and the place was just empty. Despite this, the anticipation for what he smelled was too great. They find a place to sit down and this guy approaches. Looks like a skeleton. He's so thin. The guy couldn't even strike a smile. I mean, yes, the place isn't booming, but at the same time, the dude could slap a smile on his face. Reserve's like, are you sure we shouldn't reconsider this? And it's interesting because Rudeus is like, you know, Reserve has never really second guessed my decisions, but for some reason now he is. It's like, no, now. The food could be delicious. Smiling awkwardly, the restaurant owner like hands over a menu. There was only 2 items on this menu: dragon meat Nanahoshi Style and albus fish stew. He knows that typically with the menu, especially on Milshin, there would be at least 10 items on it, but he does note that it was cheap. This is where he notes what alba fish is. He said it's a species that's native in the southern seas. He says it's a standard part of a lot of people's diets in these parts. So they had some in Westport, and it typically came with like a vegetable-like soup. But apparently in the Dragon King realm, this is a very common thing. That's when he looks into the dragon meat Nanahoshi Style. He said he's never heard of it before. He said that he knew king dragons resided in the nearby mountains, and that's where they got their name from. They were capable of actually manipulating gravity itself. He's like, was this actually meat from them, or maybe possibly it just tasted similar? And what does Nanahoshi mean? Again, I know what it means. He said it sounded almost Japanese. Rudeus notes, you know, look, I wasn't really too familiar with the various cuisines in this world. He said maybe it's some sort of popular cooking style in the King Dragon realm. At this point, all 3 of them choose the same thing. They want the meat. The guy leaves expressionlessly back to the kitchen. He notes at this point they didn't even offer any water, which he says is kind of typical to a lot of these restaurants, but he usually kind of creates a cup out of earth magic and then he'll fill it with his own water, his Rudeus H2O, which he mentions later. He also even adds a little bit of ice magic, that way it can kind of cool it down. Edis immediately drinks it down, eats all the ice, and then immediately says more. He's like, I typically will tell her to do her own, like have her cast her own spells and refill it, but he's a little bit too afraid of just causing a flood in this restaurant. Roger, on the other hand, is just kind of sitting there slowly sipping away. He says that he's really quick to eat, but when it comes to drinking, he's usually very slow about it. While they're waiting for their food, they kind of talk about their plans currently. There was a little bit of emphasis on the idea that they kind of wanted to check out a lot of the weapon shops, but they kind of really quickly realized that a lot of these places have really crude weapons. They're kind of garbage for beginners. Something that Edis herself took a while to realize. Yes, her fighting style has come a long ways, but her eye for good quality isn't quite there yet. Suddenly, they're interrupted by a loud bang. Hi, I'm coming in. This thuggish man comes stomping into the restaurant. He says, hey, Randolph, you finally in the mood to make the right decision today? Randolph, the skeleton-thin restaurant owner, says, my answer isn't going to change no matter how many times you ask. Will you just leave, please? This guy's like, ha! How long are you going to keep this empty wreck of a place running, man? He says, until I die, of course. It's been in my family for generations. Rudeus is figuring out, yeah, this is probably some place that's just struggling to survive and had loans, and some thug is trying to buy up the place for cheap. Restaurant owner says, you know, look, wait for a minute. I got customers right now. He's like, wow, it's a rare sight. He says, I won't give it this place as long as I have a single customer. Reese is like, you know, this place sounds like it's having a rough time. You know, if the food's good at least, then I wouldn't mind going around and spreading the word of how great it is. It's like kind of like the whole superb thing. It's like he can't help himself but going, yeah, I'll give a good word in for these people just to help them out. At this point, Edis is like, Miss Man's looking at us. And so Rudy decides to cover up her eyes. Like, you know, doesn't want some fight breaking out here. And he's just kind of playing around with her by covering up her eyes. And she's grabbing him by the wrist. And he's like, oh, no, not my poor wrist. It's very delicate. At this point, the restaurant owner finally comes out and places down the food on the table. And Rudeus is like, no way. He goes into explaining what this dragon meat Nanahoshi style is. Something very familiar with him. It has 3 parts. The first is transparent vegetable soup, simple, refreshing flavor. And then he said, white rice. The emperor of all grains. was sitting on this plate. And he says, no, wait, the color's not quite right. It seemed more like a mixture of grains. But he says that it explains why there was such a nostalgic aroma coming from this place. And then he notes the meat itself. He says, golden brown chunks of deep fried goodness. He says, without a doubt, this is karaage. This whole thing was a classic karaage meal. Rudeus says, I can't believe it. And Ariel is like, what is it, Rudeus? He's like, well, understandable that my reaction, I was basically saying that while I'm clutching my hands on the side of the table. Like he's so into what's in front of him. He's like, oh, it's nothing. And yeah, if this doesn't tell you Nanahoshi, this girl that's with Orsted, if that's the same Nanahoshi, this kind of implies that if this style is from her, she's from Japan. He's like, I'd never dreamed that there would be a Japanese food style that existed in this world. He's thinking like, maybe the man god finally figured out what I truly want from this world. Like simple things. What is with isekais and wanting the most simplest of Japanese food? Immediately, he started shoveling the food into his mouth, tears running down his cheeks. He said in his previous life, he had a passion for rice that had no bounds. He gobbled a gallon of it every single day. Now, he's noting that this is pretty lousy what's in front of him, but still, it would kind of earn a C in a Japanese taste ranking. But still, it was rice. Honest to goodness rice. And it made him realize that day that all rice was created equal. He decided at this point, look, I'm gonna save some of it. Like, I wanna try this other stuff out. Let's save a little of this for later. And that's what he chews into the meat itself. He said the rancid odor grew in his mouth every time he chewed down. He's like, what the heck is this? He became nauseous. He's like, you expect me to eat rice with this? He's like, technically, yes, the rice itself I could probably eat all day. Like unlimited amounts of it, as long as it had a little bit of salt. But he couldn't contain his anger. The karaage was simply an insult to the rice itself. He said, I want to see the chef now. Owner comes out, and he actually starts with the compliments. He's like, let's get the compliments out of the way. He's like, the pseudo miso is passable. It was a simple, clear, salty vegetable soup. And he compliments him on the multigrain rice. They themselves felt like a complete meal. And he says only a skilled artisan could have pulled this off. The rice, he used the right amount of water and the heat. If he paid a little more attention to the quality of the water that he used, it would have been a perfect score. He's like, I would even be perfectly fine to offer my delicious Rudeus brand H2O. The stuff is better than stuff you'll find in your backyard. The problem was the karaage, or rather the Nanahoshi style dragon meat. He shredded it out thoroughly and brutally. This stuff was not fit for human consumption. How dare you serve this to a customer? Does he have any... This is where I started getting the same thought process here. Any idea who I was? I was Rudeus Grey Rat of Dead End. He'd dearly pay for this insult. He says, long story short, I flipped out on the guy like a psychotic celebrity chef in a foul mood. What are you? An idiot sandwich? We all were thinking the same thing. We were all thinking the same chef. He says it in retrospect, I'm not sure why I got so angry. Maybe it was because I was still hungry. Edison Majord thought I had lost my mind. By the end of it, they dragged him out, and he was just kicking and screaming. He said, honestly, I went too far, but my love for rice had gotten the better of me. He realized he can't really justify what he said. I mean, technically, he's an amateur himself. This world didn't technically have the ingredients that are available in Japan. Even oil was of lower quality. But still, today he learned that people in this world ate rice and side dishes, and that deep frying was actually a thing. He should be happy. Why was I so furious? By the time he had left, the owner had tears in his eyes. I'd definitely been a childish jerk. Should do better next time. This is where we cut to the perspective of Randolph, the owner, as Rudeus is now gone. He says, for the last several years, I barely had any visitors. No one turned into a regular. I was sinking further and further into debt. To top that off, a customer today hit me with a barrage of criticism. I wasn't getting my oil nearly hot enough, wasn't trapping enough of the moisture into the meat. Oh, and I should have been adding sweet and sour seasoning before I put coating in. By the end, the kid had told me I had chosen the wrong kind of meat in the first place. But dragon meat was a backbone of this restaurant for hundreds of years. Shag Hall, this thug guy, is still in the restaurant. He's like, man, that seriously startled me. But you think that makes things crystal clear, right? Your cooking is lousy enough that a snot-nosed kid would rip it to pieces. Randolph in his head's like, man, this guy is constantly pestering me for years now. He knows that Shagall has this ugly smirk plastered on his face. He says that he's a good-looking man and wasn't stupid. If he walked in the right room, dozens of subordinates would bow their heads to him. But for some reason, he liked to dress up like a thug and sneer at him. He's like, maybe it's some sort of disguise that he likes to put on. Shagall says, look, I understand that you want to protect something that's been in your family for generations. The thing is, though, you don't have the head for business or the power to keep it running. He's like, yes, I know. He's right. I'm a hopeless businessman. I didn't even have the talent to be a chef. Shackle says, that said, you have real skills in a different field. Everyone has their jobs they're suited for. Randolph's like, I suppose you're right. All right, you win. I'll close down the restaurant. This restaurant was founded like 250 years ago, passed down through generation to generation. But Randolph realized he had failed to preserve that legacy. He's just going to have to carry that failure for the rest of his life. On this day, the High General Shagal Gargantus of the King Dragon Realm succeeded in recruiting Randolph Mariane, the Death God, ranked 4th amongst the 7 great powers. What? Why would he suddenly accept the offer after so many years? Very few would ever know. Rudeus nearly died. Rudeus nearly died. It's a good thing this Death God was a nice dude, because Rudeus nearly died. I just have like this mental image of like Rudeus with like Gordon Ramsay face going on, yelling at this Death God, and the Death God's like, I could literally sneeze and you'll die. The 4th strongest person in the world, technically, was making really bad karage. I don't know why. Again, I kind of mentioned the idea that I don't necessarily see this as being a chapter that, oh my gosh, I cannot believe they didn't adapt this. Because we'll meet this Death God eventually. It's just a funny chapter. And honestly, since Rudeus didn't know who he's talking to, there's no significance here that is going to affect him. Unless later on he bumps into this Death God and is like, you're that guy that made that crappy karage for me. And then it's not going to make any sense in the anime if they ever do that. But it was still like, okay, why is the Death God here? And why are we suddenly running into him? But again, the bigger picture here is the Nanahoshi Style. This is literally, for me, a confirmation of the suspicions that I've had for a long time. When I originally watched the anime, when he got to the point where the second turning point happened, he ran into Orsted and this Nanahoshi. And again, the Nanahoshi name in a world where there's no Japanese names. But I think it kind of confirmed it in the idea that in the novel, they never mentioned this idea that the other students were missing in the accident before he transports this world. And because the anime went out of its way to mention the idea that, hey, there was a girl there and she's missing, made me believe that that was Nanahoshi, that she got transported to this world as well, and she's been traveling around with Orsted. And so now, again, this chapter right here, having read this after watching the anime to the end of the first season, I'm like, that's it. Now, I'll be curious to see when we do get to Turning Point 2, if he will mention her name's Nanahoshi. Was she the one that made that style? I'll be curious to see if he mentions that, because that'll be kind of interesting. But yeah, still, I can't get enough of Rudeus being Gordon Ramsay. You feeding me this garbage? Who do you think you are? I'm Rudeus of Dead End. But anyways, my terrible British aside, let's move on. Yes. Obviously, the other big question mark this chapter raises is, why is the High General of this King Dragon Realm recruiting the 4th strongest of the 7 greatest powers? It kind of, yes, ominously places this idea of what's going down. Like this is indicating that something is about to go down. This is a very powerful figure in the world itself. Again, the 4th strongest in the world, and this being a High General makes me think that some war is about to break out. Yes, technically it could just be I need your help because, maybe the whole situation that might possibly come up in Asuran. Like I said, it's indicating that something's about to go down, and I'm very curious if who's all going to be involved in whatever that is, and yes, technically if somebody's going to end up having to go face and face with the Death God. I just realized... I remember when we were watching the anime, and at some point, it was that whole travel through the Mills continent, and at some point, Rudeus was talking to Geese about, well, what's this stone on the side of the road? The 7 great powers, the stone that showed the 7 great powers. And at some point, Rudeus said something to the effect of, wow, if Rajurd's afraid of going against these people or looking to be an apprentice of them, I'm really afraid of us running into them. And I think the joke at the time when we were watching the anime was, oh yeah, and eventually he runs into Orsted. No, before then, he ran to the Death God. I gotta find it funny that he ran to the Death God first. But yes, technically things worked out a lot better with the Death God than Orsted. So yeah, funny. This is where we move on to the final chapter of Volume 5. And I want to make it perfectly clear for anybody that is going to stick to anime only. This is going to be stuff that might possibly end up in the second season. There might be a brief kind of glancing over what's going to happen in this section. I don't think they're going to go through all the details of this chapter, but I do believe this might be something that they'll cover in a little bit of detail in the second season, so keep that in mind. And yes, this is the big chapter with a title that spoils Extra Chapter 2, The Death of Ariel. It opens up with this guy named Gustav, and Gustav is a information broker that lives in the city of Ars. And yes, Ars being the capital of the kingdom of Asura. He's really good at what he does, and he got a wind of a certain rumor that's spreading around the area. Apparently, the second princess Ariel has been murdered by unknown assailants while traveling to enroll in the Renoa University of Magic. Yes, technically in the previous volumes, we mentioned this idea that Pilemon was recommending that she gets out of this area and go enroll at this, magic academy and just get away from here because obviously things are stirring up. She's currently at odds for the throne with her brother. And Gustav kind of assumes this whole rumor is being spread by the prince himself, being that he is the bitter rival of Ariel. Gustav kind of knows that in order to kind of avoid some big grand farewell, Ariel had kind of slipped out of the city in secrecy. The group that she went off with was about 17 men total. One, of course, being the playboy Luke Notice Greyrat. Additionally, the highly conspicuous bodyguard Silent Fitz. By this point, rumors are already spreading that Ariel was being sent out into exile due to losing a power struggle in the royal court. But a few weeks later, news of this hearsay of her death started to make its rounds. But due to this being kind of spreading very quickly and the fact that there's unknown assailants and it's from an anonymous source, he doesn't really know if it's true. But even still, he doesn't want to get involved. Like, drawing the attention of some scheming nobles is not a good thing. So he's gonna just stay in dark on this one. Until eventually, someone came to see him. Yes, a retainer for Pilemon Notice Greyrat, which, of course, as we mentioned earlier, is one of the leaders of Ariel's faction. Pilemon and Ariel were kind of working side by side in order to boost her influence amongst the nobles. Now, this retainer came to him with a fake name, and immediately Gustav, laying out who he really is and all this information, the guy immediately finally kind of realized, okay, this guy knows what he's doing. He said Pilemon wants to find out if Princess Ariel is indeed dead, and he wants to hire him to do it. Now, again, he was going to steer clear of this whole situation, but the money was good. Money talks, and it was really good money. So he decided to start an investigation. Look into this for Pilemon. It all starts with him retracing her steps, following the path that she took up north in the direction of Renoa. He kind of assumed that she may have taken an alternate route, but it looks like everything showed signs that she went straight there. Gathering information, eventually finds out, yes, a group of people cloaked in black eventually would pursue them. And apparently along the way, Ariel had lost 2 men during that escort. Despite this, she kept pressing forward. Over time, her group reduced down to 10, initially having 17. But she finally reached the checkpoint in the northern border. This is a large, well-guarded facility that pressed up against this large forest on the other side. It was just south of the valley known as the Red Worm Upper Jaw. This is where Gustav got a testimony from a border control officer, Smiley Gatlin. The guy goes in to mention the fact that he was having a lousy day that day, didn't really feel like that. Like, he felt like the job he was doing was beneath him. Doing a lot of busy work, checking passes. Sometimes he would search different people for contraband. Said that mostly people that came through here were merchants and adventurers. Merchants usually had valid passes. Adventurers simply using their guild card can get through. He knows specifically that mercenaries and first-time travelers typically would go through a formal inspection before they would get their passes. But he states, that's not really my job. Unless you're some notorious criminal or something, your documents would get issued soon enough. He says they're not too strict on this side of the checkpoint. But he says that he's also responsible for stopping criminals. But the soldiers are the ones that take care of the rough stuff. But that usually doesn't happen because most criminals, if your name's on a poster or something, you're going to get smuggled through. You're not going to go through a checkpoint. And he's talking about why his mood was so low. Like, this job is just unrewarding. There's no chance of recognition doing this job. The thought of him growing old doing this just was miserable to him. He also said that it didn't help that the soldiers themselves, he wasn't on good terms with them. He regarded them as imbeciles, and they thought him as some sort of pansy with an overgrown ego. This frustrated him because he's a graduate of a prestigious aristocratic academy. His talents are wasted in this backwater, or so he believed at the time. That's when an arrival came around noon. This luxurious looking 2-seated carriage comes rolling up, 7 guards on foot around it, a total of 10 people. He assumed it was some aristocrat that was out sightseeing, but this was the border of the kingdom. Beyond this checkpoint was this dangerous land known as the Northern Territory. It was plagued by snow and monsters. Nobles did sometimes pass, but typically they brought like 3 carriages and like 20 guards, or they would just make do with a band of elite adventurers. But this group didn't seem like they were battle-hardened warriors. They were all dressed for the road, clearly not accustomed to long journeys. They looked rather scrawny. He's thinking to himself, well, perhaps they're inspecting the checkpoint. You can never discount some high-ranking lord doing that. So he asked them, "Can I see your pass?" And they hand it over. He says the one that hands it over is this remarkably handsome looking man. He had clear signs of exhaustion, dark circles under his eyes, but he says that something was odd about the situation. The pass was good. Normally he would let them through, but something about the man's face made him hesitate. In hindsight, he knows who this guy was. This was Luke Notice Greyrat, but not at the time. He had a habit of detaining anybody that looked vaguely familiar to him. I mean, he looked over all of these wanted posters, and so anybody that looked familiar, he would immediately stop them. So he says, "Can I see inside your carriage?" And upon hearing this, the soldiers knew. Like, his soldiers that are around him knew exactly what to do. They all moved to block all the exits of the checkpoint. He's like, "Yes, we're not on the friendliest of terms here," but when it came to their job, these soldiers acted. Immediately upon this whole situation, Luke and his men immediately put their hands upon their swords. He says these guys didn't move fast as a master warrior, but he had a feeling they had their fair share of combat. In particular, the white-haired, short-statured boy who stood behind Luke looked quite intimidating. He carried this small rod, something that like a beginner in magic would have. But something about him suggests that he was truly a lethal fighter, with the wariness of a seasoned vet. He supposed at this point that this was Silent Fitz. He said, "I don't think I've ever been so frightened by a boy half my age." At this point, he's thinking to himself, this group could cause significant damage to this garrison. He hesitated to even order the guards to seize him. But that's when a voice came out of the carriage. "Stop this, Luke." This voice was like gold. His brain turned to mush. It was hypnotic. He wanted to listen to this voice forever. He heard it 10 years prior during an academy's graduation ceremony at the Capitol. A certain personage offered a speech to congratulate our valedictorian. Everyone cursed themselves for not having studied harder. But yeah, this is when Princess Ariel comes out of the carriage and said, "These men are simply being diligent in their duties." A shiver ran down his spine. I couldn't forget her if I even tried. He remembered the joy that it felt at the prospect of serving her in this kingdom. Everyone felt, every single one of the men in the area fell to one knee. Ariel says there is no need for that. There is a law that no one serving at the border post ever has to kneel in the course of their ordinary duties. Gustav says, yes, that's technically true. And this was the case. They never bowed to anybody. But yet, right here, everybody did. Technically, it was stating that it wasn't required to bow, but it wasn't forbidden to bow. And despite her saying this, everyone stayed there. Everybody bowed their heads towards Ariel. It just simply felt like it was something they had to do. "Princess Ariel, I feel it's my duty to ask, but why have you come to the border crossing such as this, with such a small retinue?" She's like, "Weren't you told anything in advance?" At this point, Officer Gatlin says he knew something strange was going on. A senior border control officer, a noble serving as mayor in a nearby town, would go months without showing his face there. He'd ride over, give a few orders if he needed to. On the last visit, he told them that within the next few months, a certain very noble personage may pays a visit here. Ariel says, "That's what you were told?" He in fact continued, "The personage will likely be seeking to cross the border and flee to the north. However, you mustn't allow this. Find a reason to hold the party back and keep them waiting in a town for several days." In his own mind, he says, in other words, to ensure their death. It's not the first time he's ever heard these orders. It was relatively common that nobles would blunder and so badly that they would need to flee to the north. Sometimes they were given the order to allow them safe journey to the north, and other times they would be told to delay them until they inevitably go missing. Gatlin thinks to himself, "I'm a commoner, raised in the capital, but I know the struggles of power. Those that died were the enemy of the faction of his supervisor, and those that lived were allies of that faction. The lovely princess had lost the fight against the allies of my supervisor, and now is on the run." Ariel says, "What's the matter? Answer me." At this point, he's lost in thought. Seems simple enough. Smile and say there was a problem with her pass. Have her come back tomorrow. Finding a fault wouldn't be difficult for him. But he was wondering if that was what he wanted to do, if what he should do. What was his purpose at this dull border posting? He wasn't serving his country. Not once did that thought ever cross his mind while he was working there. In fact, there was only one moment that he felt some genuine patriotic zeal, when he first laid eyes on the Princess Ariel. That day, he truly thought that he was a small part of a proud country. Serving it and her brought him joy. Recalling those feelings, he's asked himself, was I willing to step back and leave this young princess to her fate? The answer to himself was immediate and decisive. I was told to stop that noble personage here and ensure they spent several days waiting at a nearby town. Everybody in the area visibly reacted, but Ariel stayed calm. "I see. Then what do you intend to do then?" Says nothing in particular. You're not going to carry out your orders? No matter how strange they may be, ignoring them could end up with your head chopped off. He chuckled at the bluntness of her words. "My orders, miss? Not sure what you're talking about there. I never heard of a very noble personage heading to a foreign country with a single shabby horse cart and fewer than 10 guards." At this moment, I'm just dealing with a rather pompous young lady whose name I don't even know. Mind me asking who you are, miss? Ariel laughed in genuine amusement, perhaps enjoying this farce as much as he was. I am Ariel Canalusa, the only child of a low-ranked noble. He says, well, Miss Canalusa, what brings you to the north? I'm traveling to Renoa to enroll at the University of Magic. Is that so? Well, I see no issues. Please, move forward. Safe travels to you. She says thank you with a small, graceful bow. She stepped back into the carriage, and they immediately moved forward. Guards following, slightly confused. Following this, he noticed that every soldier in the area was looking straight at him. He had no idea what was about to happen. He didn't obey the command that was given to him, and he assumed that these soldiers were probably given the same exact command, not to let them through. And then one approaches him, the captain of all the soldiers, comes up to him. He lifted his hand and slapped him on the back. I knew this was coming. It was barely any pain at all. He said, nice work, buddy. The other soldiers all lifted their fists into the air and roared in approval. He learned later that practically all the soldiers at the checkpoint were all fans of the princess. The guy said, permission to speak freely, Officer Gatlin? We've all been losing our damn minds in frustration since we got dumped off here. But you just put us in a good mood for the first time in ages. Ain't that right, boys? And everybody said, hell yeah. At this point, he invites him back to the tavern, drinks on him. As the captain slapped him on the back once again, he had a feeling wash over him. He thought of these guys as different than him. He convinced himself that they were a pack of crude, unschooled thugs and had no loyalty to the royal family. But in fact, they were just like him, dumped in the middle of nowhere, directed to obey a miserable bastard. Realizing this, he now started feeling a sense of pride in his work. From then on, he was in good terms with all the soldiers there. His job brought him pleasure, all thanks to Princess Ariel without a doubt. Simply gracing them with her presence made it a far happier place. At this point, the guy goes on this long monologue about how much he appreciates Princess Ariel, but Gustav decided to omit that whole part. At this point, he asked him, did anybody follow them? Was there any men clouded in black that were pursuing her? At that point, his face turned gloomy. They weren't exactly pursuers of her, I believe, but a group of suspicious characters passed through the checkpoint 3 days before she arrived. I wasn't on duty at the time, but I learned about that later. He kind of assumes that there's a possibility they went before her in order to ambush her later. And he really does hope that she's safe. He said, if I had known, I would have warned her before she left. But now all I can do is just pray for her safety. At this point, Gustav notes that this guy obviously doesn't know about the rumors of her death, which does kind of bring a little suspicion the idea that it might have been Origin back at the kingdom. Knowing this, he decides that he's going to continue his investigation. He chose to go to the nearby town and ask around there. He also talked to a lot of the soldiers that were at the checkpoint as well. He needed to know what happened beyond the wall. So he's also checked with a lot of people that would travel back and forth. Eventually, he came across a merchant with a story to tell. This was Bruno the merchant. It opens up with Bruno talking about that day he was busy bringing wares from Asura. Like always, he came down through the red worm upper jaw and followed the single road that runs through the worm's whiskers. The worm's whiskers being pretty much what they call the forest that's just up north. He was carrying a load of, he believes they were pelts that are only found in the northern regions. Gustav asked him if he was with anybody. He's like, no, I was alone. I don't really have the money to hire guards. I'm pretty decent in the fighter myself. I spent some time at the Sword Sanctum. It was just me and my buddy Robinson. Says, where's Robinson? He's like, oh, he's out in the stables. They don't really serve donkeys here. Obviously, Robinson being a donkey. His faithful donkey, Robinson. This guy loves talking about Robinson, his donkey. He was in a cheerful mood. He was just at the point where he had enough money that he was going to buy a cart. He was really excited to buy this cart because he'd be able to carry so much more goods. But unfortunately, eventually, his mood sank when he heard some clashing of metals. Something fishy was in the air. He's been making a living solo for so long, he had a good nose for danger. He said it was best to steer clear of trouble, but sadly, this was the only path through the whiskers. So he brought his beloved Robinson with him, not wanting to lose him to a monster, and they slowly moved forward towards the clashing sound. Eventually, he could make out the shouting of people. Robinson was a little freaked out, but he had me with him. We've been through thick and thin together. He's like, enough with the donkey, okay? He's like, wow, man, you're an impatient guy. But whatever. He says he peeked over from behind this overgrowth and he noticed a carriage. The carriage was tipped over. He noticed that some guys that looked like they were guards were fighting against some black-clothed men. At the moment, there was 7 of these black-clad men facing 4 guards. There was 2 guards, or maybe servants, that were lying on the ground. Also, there was 4 girls that were huddled next to each other next to the carriage. The guys in the black clothing had the numbers, but they were not at an advantage. There was way more of them that were lying in the dirt. There must have been a dozen down already. He thought at first that somebody made the mistake of sending a bunch of amateurs to this job for them. But then he realized shortly later that they were actually quite skilled. As skilled as the guards. They would normally win in a one-on-one fight. He knew this because, again, he studied at the Sword Sanctum. He was so curious about about the situation that he continued to watch. Then he noticed that one of the guys on the guard side was really slick. This is a kid that had white hair. He was pretty scrawny. He was only carrying a beginner's magic rod. But for some reason, he was on a whole different level than the rest of these guys. He said, in my time in the Sword Sanctum, I knew about a few people that were, on their way to become Sword Saints and Sword Kings. They felt like time moved differently for them. They were not just quick on their feet, but they could always make snap judgments on the fly. This boy was really good at making snap judgments. Whenever one of his buddies was in danger, he always quickly reacted and cast a spell to protect them. But he was always using beginner level spells. It's like he was trying to conserve his mana. Your average magician couldn't pull that off in a million years. He must have been trained in a specific way that was possible. Plus, he couldn't hear him casting spells, so he assumed this guy knew silent spellcasting. He says he never seen it before, but he assumed there was people out in the world that were able to pull that off. Over time, he noticed that the black-clad men started adapting to this boy's style. Now, having seen him mow down half of their men, and at the same time, the guards looked like they were bushed. He figured at this point that if one person on either side would have fallen, it would have been decisive to the entire battle. Suddenly, it seemed like all the black-clad men decided to shift their tactic. It was almost as if somebody had made a call at some point. All 7 of the remaining decided to peel off the guards, and they aimed directly towards this boy. They were so fast the guards couldn't react in time. But the kid could. Keeping his focus, he instantly set off a wide-range spell that took out 2 of them at once. The rest of the guys scattered. 2 of them kept after the boy, but 3 rushed the girls. The boy still managed to act, immediately aimed towards the ones heading towards the women, ignoring the 2 that were coming towards him. That's crazy, right? Normally you'd want to take out the ones that were trying to kill you, but instantly a bunch of things happened. First, the boy let off a spell that killed the 2 charging the girls. The second 2 guards that were coming towards the boy were taken out by the guards. All 4 went down at the same time. But finally, the last man in black pulled one of the girls from the group and cut her pretty little head clear off. Just a moment too late, one of the last swordsmen stabbed him from behind as he held the severed head up in satisfaction. Looking at the survivors, he noticed they were all standing in silence. They were stunned, having lost their pals and the girl they were trying to defend. At this point, he took his donkey and he left. He knew the blood in the area was going to attract monsters. At this point, Gustav had the information from Officer Gatlin's story, as well as this merchant. It was obvious at this point that she passed through the checkpoint successfully, but she was ambushed and she was killed. So obviously, the rumors were true after all. Still, a few mysteries remained. What became of the survivors, the 5 that remained? The status of Luke was unclear, but Silent Fitz was still alive. And that boy stood out in a crowd. But yet there wasn't a single word of him being back at the capital. So he must have just continued on north instead. Why would this guy return back to the capital after failing to protect the princess? Gustav figured, look, I could probably head up north, but that's beyond the scope of my investigation. My goal was to find out what happened to Ariel. What happened to her guards is not part of the deal. So he decided to head back to the royal capital. He did manage to get some rare booze from this merchant from the northern territories. Figures he's gonna go back, wrap up the job, get paid, and then go celebrate. At this point, he reports, he says, man, you should have seen the look on that guy's face. It felt good seeing a man who dealt in information way above his pay grade go pale as a ghost. He says, anyhow, case closed, I got paid in full. Celebrating, he decides to go have a nice dinner at his usual place. It was his favorite bar. He had his usual spot that he sat at that he could pretty much hear all the commotion and all the talk that was happening in the place. It was a really good place for him, for somebody that scrapes together information, to hear what people are talking about. Gather rumors and everything. People, of course, were talking about the rumors of Princess Ariel's death. At some point, he overhears 2 men, one sturdy-looking man and a significantly older one. They were talking about this, one saying, I can't believe that stuff. I don't want to believe it either, but still. Clearly, Gustav knew the truth. And he kind of found joy in the idea that everybody else was clueless puppets, but I know the truth. I'm the one that investigated things. I have the divvy. I have the information. At some point, one of them says, look, I'm stationed at a checkpoint up by the border, The younger one says, of course I know that, uncle. You just hit 20 years on the job, didn't you? That's why they gave you that extended leave. The uncle says, what a know-it-all. But did you know what I do at the checkpoint? Says, no. At this point, Gustav's like, the conversation shifted away from Princess Ariel, so I kind of lost interest. I decided to go, do the final touches on my order. The case is closed, right? The uncle says, I work up in the lookout tower. At this point, Gustav's like, crap, now I'm interested again. At the very top of this checkpoint, we have this magic that lets us see really far away. We use this to see the far end of the forest. Anyhow, word got around that Princess Ariel had passed through the gates. So all of us were dying to get a glimpse of her. So we watched out of this eye with bloodshot eyes. Nobody wanted to look away. We want to keep looking for her to go out of the forest. So the nephew says, well, did you see your ex at the forest? Nicholas says, sure did. It was Princess Ariel, no doubt. Gustav's thinking to himself, this can't be right. He's obviously lying. Or was Bruno lying? Well, but what reason would Bruno have to lie? Maybe the last person that was killed wasn't the princess. He had heard that Osran royal family had this fancy magic that lets them change their form so they look like somebody else. It was a way of creating a perfect body double. She may have used that to survive. I jumped to the wrong conclusions. I delivered faulty information. This wasn't good. I needed to get a firm confirmation of the story and tell the client the truth. There's a chance that she survived and she enrolled in the University of Magic. Truth would get out sooner or later. He's like, hell with it. He instead decided to enjoy his meal. He said, the last thing I needed to have some stuck-up noble ask me for a refund. I would just have to leave the capital for a bit. In the end, the broker, Gustav, provided faulty information to the client. As a direct result, Pilemon Nodos Greyrat, foremost member of Ariel's faction, was compelled to make a painful choice that would leave him in somewhat of a predicament. But that's a story for another time. And that's it. Done. Volume 5 is done. I will admit, I got a little bit of kick reading this last chapter, but I will say it wasn't the most interesting one. I think it was a nice little thing of having kind of this back and forth. It was almost like a roundabout way to tell the story of Princess Ariel's journey, seeing it from the perspective of the people around. But I will say that like the whole segment with the border crossing, I thought that was really cool, mainly because the idea that when it got to that point where he let them pass, I got a huge kick out of it because he started to feel dread about the soldiers around him. But if we recall way back here when Pilemon and Ariel were talking about how they can gain favorability to Ariel, what was the one group that they were looking at? The military. And even the prince hated it. They were getting a hold of the military. They didn't feel like the military were going to be rushing the gates, but they knew that if they wanted to create a coup, controlling the military was important. So that was one of Ariel's goals. So it made sense that these guards knew who she was. And so when they came up to see him, it was like, no, they're going to be on board with you, man. There ain't no way they're not going to be on board with you. But yeah, sure enough, it almost gives you a sense of all these people are being controlled by the heads. But still, because of the influence that she gave upon them, because she made such an impact on each of these people's lives, the citizens, the grunts, they were so willing to serve her. I mean, it made sense, the idea that the moment that she came out of that carriage, they all hit their knees because it was Ariel. They didn't have to. They're actually given the ability to not. Because then you're going to show favoritism, you're going to bow your head to somebody that you should be, on equal terms with in order to issue them to go across or not. If some nobility comes there and says, oh, sorry, your pass is wrong. Well, no, you're bowing to me. Let me pass. So it's like this allowance of them not to bow. But they all did anyways, because she's that important to them. It gave a sense of this patriotism that she created, that these people really do love and respect her, which does have me... It sucks that we pretty much jump from Pilemon and Ariel were working together in order to allow her to succeed the throne. But then it just quickly jumps to, oh, now she's running away. So we don't get a sense of what the hell happened. Why is she suddenly fleeing? I mean, the whole sense was the idea that they kept sending assassins to the point where she had to flee. But it's I don't know, maybe she's gonna go to the academy, gain strength there. I'm really curious as to what they're going to do with this whole situation because, again, to the kingdom, she's dead. So when she's out here, is she going to be working behind the scenes in secrecy in order to gain favor? Her goal is still to become the queen. So how can she do that when she's essentially fled? Is she giving up on that goal? Is she going to, I don't know, seek other strength and then come in and take over the kingdom? That's my assumption. I have a feeling that Fitz and Luke and Ariel have all flayed. We're going to do some training there, and eventually it's going to be, all right, time to take over. It's time to take over this place. Because we've been getting a sense for a while now, especially through the perspective of Ariel and her desire to succeed the throne. The original reason why Derek was trying to support her was because he knew the place was dying. This kingdom was they were so self-indulged in the royalty that eventually the surrounding kingdoms were going to take them over. I mean, that's the possibility there, is that instead of Princess Ariel coming back and fighting to gain the throne, they might just get destroyed by the surrounding kingdoms. Because that's obviously a chance there. It's something they've been kind of hinting at for quite a while. But yeah, really good set of chapters. Again, besides my feeling a little let down by finally reading the novel version of Roxy's chapter, the whole... introduction of the Death God, and yes, technically seeing Ariel fleeing, despite my seeing the title of Princess Ariel dead, I'm like, what the crap? But no, it ends up being a fake out. She made it. She's fine. I think I don't remember if we seen her in the anime when they showed that brief shot of the room where Fitz was at. Fitz. But anyways, that is Volume 5. Looking forward to diving into Volume 6. I hope you guys enjoyed this video as always. If you did, again, as usual, make sure to hit that like button down below. Leave me a comment that helps support me and gets me in the algorithm. If you're new to the channel, make sure that subscribe button so you get all my content. I do news, reviews, first impressions, top list. If it's anime, it's pretty much here. Additionally, you can find my playlist where I've been going through the entirety of the Mushoku Tensei Jobless Reincarnation novel series. Looking forward to getting to 6 and wrapping up what the anime covered. We'll see. Additionally, if you like my content and you want to support the channel more, I have a Patreon link, a tips link, and a super thanks button down below. I greatly appreciate everybody that supports the channel. Until the next Mushoku Mondays, y'all take care.